Hello, little helpers. Today we have an awesome guest. He is not only a distinguished professor of psychological and brain sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara, but he's also one of Paul's very best friends and celebrated my proposal with me. So we're very happy to have Dr. Jonathan Schooler come speak with us today about repressed traumatic memories that have been recovered. Although I know from reading your paper, Jonathan, that is not your favorite term. So can you tell us how you got into this line of work?
Sure. So I trained with Elizabeth Loftus, who many of your listeners may have heard of. She's a world expert on false memories and really pioneered research in eyewitness memory and doing testimony on eyewitness memory in court cases. And during the 90s, when the whole issue of recovered memories became a really big thing, she developed some very strong and in many respects compelling arguments for why we should be concerned that these individuals who are reporting having suddenly remembered long forgotten memories of abuse, particularly that when this happened in therapy, that these memories could be the product of therapist suggestions. She'd done a lot of research on the misinformation effect and showing that people can plant false memories. And being, her student, I was obviously very open to this perspective. I'd created my share of false memories myself over the years. But I was at a conference talking to a clinical researcher, and he said that he knew a person who had a recovery memory that had been corroborated, very well corroborated, that the person had contacted the perpetrator and the perpetrator had confessed. And prior to his recovery, he thought he'd had absolutely no memory. So this went really at odds with the sort of party line that these memories were simply the product of therapist suggestions. So I reached out to him, and he gave a very persuasive testimonial. And then I reached out to another individual who had been abused by the same person who had abused him. And it seemed quite compelling that this was not just a fabrication, but that he actually was the victim of abuse. That's what got me started on this.
That's fascinating. So does it, in that moment, were you going against Dr. Loftus, like, oh, wait, not all of these recovered memories are false?
Well, not just in that moment, but then I felt compelled to write a paper about it and then also investigate to see if I could find more cases. And indeed, I found ultimately 7 cases of individuals with compelling memory discovery experiences corresponding to corroborated abuse. And yes, Beth was not happy with my take on this perspective. We ultimately, sort of worked it through. I reasonably sort of agreed to disagree. We both agree that these memories can be the product of suggestion. And I think that she feels somewhat skeptical about the cases that I corroborated. She certainly never mentions them. And she does like, however, one of the ideas that I talked about, which is something we call the forgot it all along effect. In several of these cases, we found that individuals had forgotten that they had previously remembered it. So they believed that they had, entirely repressed the memory since it had happened. But in fact, they talked about it with their 2 different individuals had talked about it with their spouse during the period they thought they'd been amnesic, making us think that part of what's going on here is that people are forgetting their prior state of knowledge about the experience, causing them to think it was more of a dramatic recovery than it actually was. That part she likes.
Do you have a hypothesis of how this is happening? I mean, because it does seem especially surprising. You'd think that the traumatic event would occur the hippocampus or something like wouldn't encode it, and then it would be forgotten. But this idea that they actually did remember this years later, talked with spouses, and then forgot this entire chain of events is really surprising.
Yeah. I think there are a number of different mechanisms that are involved in this phenomena. And also, even the claim that you wouldn't remember the event in the first place, that's a very controversial claim. The standard view is that memory for emotional experiences is going to be substantial. There is a little bit of a discrepancy in the literature, even with respect to my mentor, Beth Loftus, in the sense that there is both the argument that eyewitness memory is compromised by strong emotional experiences, and also the claim that but strong emotional experiences can't be forgotten entirely. So that's kind of the standard party line, is that yes, these memories are not going to be terrific, but you're not going to forget that the event happened entirely. So the way that I thought about this draws on a concept that I've gotten a fair bit of mileage out of over the years, something that we call meta-awareness, which is your explicit awareness of what's going on in your mind or experience at a particular time. And the idea is that we aren't necessarily always meta-aware of what's going on. So the classic example is mind wandering, which I know you're familiar with. Mind wandering is a situation where you're, say, reading and not paying any attention to the words as your eyes move across the page. Your eyes are moving, but your mind is somewhere else. And the interesting thing is we do this all the time, unfortunately. And oftentimes it takes a while for us to notice that we're mind wandering. That's the reason why we're able to continue for so long without having any idea what we're reading. And so the idea is that only intermittently are we meta-aware of what's going on. In this case, meta-aware of the fact that we're mind wandering. And so I've taken this idea of intermittent meta-awareness in the context of mind wandering and applied it to the context of what I refer to as discovered memories. And just a quick aside on that, and this term never did really catch on, but the idea is that you're discovering a memory. There's no doubt that you feel that you've discovered a memory. That memory might be genuine, or it might be the product of suggestion, but it's definitely a discovered memory. So it doesn't have that quality of necessarily having to be true. And in any case, when individuals have memory discovery experiences, there are a number of different things that could be going on. One possibility is that the individual had one meta-awareness of the experience at the time. That is, they understood it in one way initially. This is an awkward experience I'm having. But they're kids, they don't really have the same framework for conceptualizing the experience as they did when they thought about it as an adult. And
so they weren't thinking of it as abuse necessarily at the time. It's just this sort of strange occurrence. Okay.
Exactly. Right. And so the experience of the memory discovery, they're confusing the discovery of the understanding of the abuse with the discovery of the memory itself. And they think, I must have not known about this at all because I didn't know I was a victim of abuse before, and now I do. So there's a new understanding, a discovery of the new understanding. And it wasn't as big a deal to the kid because they didn't have that same understanding. I'm not saying it's not a terrible thing to do. I'm just saying from the child's perspective, they didn't have the same framework that they do as an adult. Mm-hmm. And so part of, in several of the cases, the individuals explicitly described this sort of shift in their understanding of the experience between when it happened originally, the recollection of when it happened originally, and when it happened later on.
you give us an example of when this happened? Give us
So
a case.
in one case, a person was abused by by a family friend. And she said her recount of how she remembered it originally was, I mean, it sounds very silly actually to me, because I remember this guy was making some kind of disgusted sound. Then he pushed me away. And my immediate interpretation was that I had done something wrong and that I was somehow at fault. Right. So initially she's thinking this is this weird interaction. And then she's asked to go see a talk on sexual abuse. And then in the context of thinking about it in sexual abuse, she now is thinking, oh my God, that thing, that awkward thing, that was sexual abuse. So that's one example. Another one was an individual who was raped while hitchhiking. And she said that she originally thought of it as, I made such a mess out of it by resisting what I thought was supposed to be a sexual experience. And then later on, she's having a conversation with someone who refers to another person at a party as certainly not a virgin. And this woman lost her virginity in this rape situation. She said, in the context of that, she said, my God, I've been raped. That's a crime. I was 16, just a kid. I couldn't defend myself. So in both cases, they've got a new way of thinking about that experience. They're discovering this new way of thinking about it. And that may be the key thing that they're discovering. And then they misattribute the discovery of the new understanding with the discovery of the actual memory itself. So that's one mechanism that I think may be going on. And I should say that Richard McNally, who's a major researcher at Harvard, he sort of has come to the same conclusion about some of these things, sort of that these may involve reinterpretations and a new understanding. So that's one. A second one is the idea that initially the individuals did have a clear meta-awareness of the experience, but that over time they stopped accessing that meta-awareness, so that maybe the memory would come to mind, but they wouldn't take stock of the fact that the memory was coming to mind, or take stock of the fact that they had been abused. So one example of this was a individual who was molested by her father in the bathroom, and I understood at the time that this was not appropriate, but then had a discovery experience many years later, interestingly, in the bathroom. And the way she had a couple of reports about how this came to her mind. And also, she talked to a friend, and the friend made an allusion to the abuse experience. And when the friend first alluded to the abuse experience, she said, this is the person who was abused, said, I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. I didn't understand anything about the experience, and I didn't want to. See, so she's avoiding meta-awareness. She's avoiding taking stock of this experience. And then another time, she's cleaning the bathroom, and she has like an image of her father in some sort of vulgar situation. And she said, when that image occurred to her the first time, she said, it left my mind immediately without me even attempting to understand it. So you can see in both of these cases, she's actively avoiding meta-awareness. She's actively avoiding going, what's going on in my mind right here? I don't know. I'm not going to touch that. It's not repression in the sense that it's not that there's some unconscious forces that are keeping it at bay. She's just avoiding thinking about it. It's a little bit like when I get a bad review and it's just like, I'm just not going to look at that for a while, right? I don't want to go there, right? So those are two of the mechanisms. The first mechanism is a changed meta-awareness. The second mechanism is losing and regaining meta-awareness. And the third mechanism is a lack of meta-awareness. The idea that initially when the experience takes place, the person is not actually taking stock of what's happening to them. And various things may contribute to this. One thing is young age. In one of the cases, the person was only 5 when the abuse happened. So we know that metacognitive abilities take time to develop. So they just may not have really taken, step back to think what's going on to me. Another thing that's like this is dissociation, where people can actually separate themselves from their body so that they don't have to take stock of what's happening to the body. And one of the cases, the person said that when she was being, in this case, raped, she said that she had the ability to literally detach myself from my body and look at myself down like it was on top of the roof. I remember thinking to myself, hey, I'm on top of this ceiling looking down. That's not really me. So really avoiding taking stock of the experience. And then the final one, and I think this is in some ways both the most interesting and also perhaps the most insidious, is nocturnal occurrence. In some of the cases, the abuse only happened in the middle of the night, right? And when people are asleep or partially asleep, I mean, we know the dreaming, total lack of meta-awareness. And so it seems quite plausible that in this semi-asleep state, they're just not taking stock, reflecting on explicitly what's happening. And when they wake up, it hasn't been consolidated. And one of the cases, the first one, in fact, the one that I mentioned that a colleague of mine introduced me to when I was at a conference, this person said, when I woke up in the morning, I didn't have any knowledge of what happened the night before, which is why I could continue to go on trips with him and enjoy it. So I think it's really possible that the nighttime nocturnal characteristic of this may be a important mechanism. Now, there are also other mechanisms that I think may be involved, encoding specificity, so that the abuse happened in a very sort of specialized context, and in different contexts, it's not as accessible. There is some nice research by my friend and colleague, Mike Anderson, who has developed something known as the think, no think paradigm, which basically finds some evidence that consistently suppressing thoughts can make them less accessible. So I think that's definitely a possibility. And he also has retrieval-induced forgetting. So if you think about something and you don't think about one aspect of that experience, if you keep thinking about the whole, if you keep thinking about part of it, but not some other part, the part that you don't think about can be forgotten. I think that can be involved. In general, I think the idea of dissociation, which is the second kind of loss of meta-awareness, may be an important component as well. So I think there are a number of different mechanisms that may be involved. And the problem is that you can't just bring somebody into the laboratory and, traumatize them and then obviously, and then, investigate these different mechanisms. So the fact that cognitive psychologists don't see evidence for this kind of forgetting is maybe not that surprising, given that we can't produce the kind of experiences that would arguably lead to this kind of process of reduced accessibility and increased accessibility.
That's all so fascinating, and really does speak to just some of my work with trauma patients who come in actually not even seeking treatment for trauma. They're anxious, they have problems with their relationship, and then in the middle of treatment, suddenly they'll remember something. And, I would always have a sense that there was something going on, but then, if I would ask them if they had any trauma, they say, no, just stressful, chaotic background. And then later a memory will pop up, but they do, at least the people I've worked with have said a part of them knew, but they didn't know. And that was really confusing for them and me, because it's like, you would think that you would remember something that terrible, but they didn't, or at least they had a sense that it's there somewhere, but not a clear memory of it. So, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very curious. The sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? The ambiguity of the accessibility of these memories. In one case, the person was raped in an elevator in a hospital as a young adult, and then the case was taken to court, and the person was found guilty. And then years later, she went to she knew that she had been the victim of childhood abuse, and she went to therapy to being the victim of childhood abuse. And they asked her, were you ever abused as an adult? Oftentimes victims of childhood abuse are also abused as adults. And she said no. And then she's driving home, and on the way home, she suddenly has to pull over on the side of the road because she's remembering that she was raped and taking the case to court. Mm-hmm. So really sort of a traumatic case, but she'd held on to the fact that she'd been abused as a child. So it's this really curious situation of knowing it and not knowing it. I would, though, again, want to emphasize that while I think that these cases that I've investigated are compelling demonstrations that these can correspond to actual episodes of abuse, there's also, I think, very compelling evidence that individuals can produce false memories, and particularly in the context of therapy, particularly when the therapists are actively thinking that they have the symptoms of someone who is abused and actively encouraging them to try to find these memories, engaging in visualization, hypnosis. All these things really seem very likely to be able to produce false memories of these types of experiences.
Yeah, well, I guess I have so many questions. I have to figure out where to start. So my question about these discovered memories that were accurate, I guess, is, are there any reliable means of discovering them? I mean, some that you talked about were, especially for the first mechanism, where they had remembered it with new information and new context as an adult, they're remembering it differently. So it seems like being able to access education, like being confronted, for instance, by this video about trauma and sexual assault, she then was able to remember what happened to her differently. Are there other means that have been reliably shown to help discovery?
So the first question, which I don't think has been shown, is whether or not that's even necessarily a helpful thing.
Yes, that's another question I had. Yeah.
There is some evidence that the PTSD symptoms sometimes arise at the time of discovery. I would say be very cautious in trying to dredge these memories up. There could be made the case, let dead dogs lie. Now, there are certainly some people, Bessel van der Kolk, for example, the body remembers. There's definitely people who think that there's the symptomatology that's in the body that is a result of these memories, and that if you can dredge them up, that allows you to be able to move on. And I think that's an interesting conjecture, and I have not carefully followed the clinical literature on this, so I'm not sure, but I know that there are others who really question that. And even if it is helpful for people, if they have genuine ones, to find them, there's the risk that in the search for genuine ones, you might create false ones. And I think most everybody would agree that creating a false traumatic memory is not a therapeutically helpful thing to do. So as far as I know, there's no techniques that have been shown to be effective and exclusively producing the authentic memories. And I should say that, much to my disappointment, I had really hoped, after having found these 7 cases, that this would really open things up and that there would be a lot of research on this topic, and you could try to look at what are the characteristics of the memories that can be corroborated, what are the characteristics of the memories that can't be corroborated, and then start to make some inferences about the likelihood that a memory is true based on if it more corresponds to corroboratable memories or to less corroboratable memories. And there was one study I was involved in that attempted to do that, but I have to say I have some misgivings about that project. And so I wish that there were more studies that have been done along these lines. And I think that's really an important step. What's really happened is I think that the vast majority of researchers have just stayed clear of this topic. It's just too hot to touch. You've got very strong opinions on both these things are only false or these things are exclusively true. And even if you have researchers such as myself, Dan Schachter would be another person, well-known memory researcher who I think has a more middle of the road perspective. But in general, although people might say, yeah, it looks like there's evidence on both sides, they don't want to touch it. So it tends to not, it has not gotten in my opinion, the careful, balanced scrutiny that it deserves.
Why not? I mean, that was as you were talking, I was like, how can we tell a true recovered memory from a false one, especially if you're talking about especially now. I imagine this is a really hot topic now because you're having people coming out of the woodwork reporting sexual abuse. And then there's a lot of judgment and doubt about them that why are you only remembering and reporting this now? If it was a real one, why didn't you say it earlier? So I would imagine this is like the research that would be done now. So why not?
I think it's scary research. You're getting into really, really prickly areas. There's some very, very strong voices you're crossing. Very powerful people. It's I don't know. I mean, that's my best guess. I spent a good 5 years really focusing on this topic, and then kind of got burned out and moved on. I feel like I did my time, and I think it would be valuable for other people to do it. The strategy is pretty straightforward in that corroboration. We found various different kinds of corroboration, but it's not that difficult to find. And maybe this is corroboration that wouldn't go beyond. I'm not sure if I would necessarily want to imprison people based on the kind of corroboration, but if you have a discovered memory and then the person who you have the memory about, someone has been unbeknownst to you, but you later determine that they abuse other people as well, that really helps to support it. If you told somebody about the abuse soon after it occurred, that is a strong piece of evidence. If the perpetrator confessed to somebody and you're able to talk to somebody who the perpetrator confessed to, those kinds of things are measurable. You can really assess those different kinds of things and then ask the question, what are the characteristics of the memories that are readily corroboratable, and what are the ones that are less so? My conjecture on this would be that if the memory happened to an individual who had no suspicion prior to it occurring to them that they were abused, that's important, because if you have a suspicion, then you're going to be like trying to find it. If it happens outside of therapy, if there's some sort of encoding specificity thing, so you see the person again for the first time, or you're in the same location where it happened and the memory comes back, all those things would be consistent with, in my conjecture, those are the characteristics of all the memories that we investigated. Whereas if the person was suspecting but had no memory that they were abused, and if they try to pull that memory out in therapy, and if it comes out sort of gradually, and they gradually build the narrative through various different memory retrieval techniques of visualization and hypnosis, then in my conjecture, it would be more likely to be false. And that is, in fact, what we found in this one paper. But as I said, I don't have confidence in it.
I would think maybe one way to research this would be to not necessarily dive into the traumatic aspect, but to see what do we know can muddle memory and what do we know can elicit accurate memory reporting. So for instance, I actually was I have a publication from undergrad with a child development researcher who was looking at ways that you can either support accurate memory recall in children or potentially help muddle the memory. And she did this by sending in a magician into a preschool. And the magician did a number of tricks. And the last one was pulling a rabbit out of the hat. The magician was supposed to fail at this trick. No rabbit happened. And then she sent the kids home and had them talk with their mothers about this while the mother recorded the conversation. And then we coded various ways that the moms talk to their kids, and then whether the kid accurately remembered that no rabbit came out of the hat, or whether they were starting to tell things like, oh yeah, the rabbit was eating carrots with us at lunchtime. The magician drove home with the rabbit in a van, but the rabbit was driving the car. So we found that there were ways that the mother would talk to the kid, primarily being autonomy supportive, so not driving the conversation themselves, but letting the kid drive the conversation, and asking open-ended questions so that the kid would make elaborative responses. So providing detail, answering their own. And then it was the mothers who were controlling of the narrative, redirecting the conversation, interrupting, and also asking for elaborative responses that created the most false memories. So now you're getting a really detailed, intricate tale that's been kind of driven too much by the mother, and then that can lead into inaccurate memories. So is that kind of work that can be done? I imagine that could be more supportive of the false memory.
Yeah,
train.
This is essentially what you're describing is kind of the relationship that can happen between the therapist and the patient. Mm-hmm. And if the therapist is really leading the narrative, then the model is that exactly that kind of thing could take place. So you would expect that, and I'm sure this is the case, that there are certain therapists who've had a, really disproportionate number of recovered memories in their practices. And I would certainly be particularly suspicious of a therapist or of the memories of patients who memories come to mind in the context of these sort of aggressive memory searching therapists. So I definitely think that is a one thing to look at. And there have been studies demonstrating that therapists really vary in the degree to which they do these kinds of active, aggressive kinds of interviews. But I don't know of studies that have looked at the frequency with which memory recoveries show up as a function of the aggressiveness of the therapist. And that would be a really cool study to investigate. In my perspective, though, really the best way to discern the accuracy of the memory is through corroboration. Mm-hmm. So is there somebody else who was abused by the same person? When one confronts the perpetrator, do they confess? Is there maybe physical evidence of some sort? That's really the technique, although one would hope that there may be other ways to sort of have a hunch about the likelihood of it being real. It's a really, really challenging situation. And one of the things that people are really not comfortable with, but in many situations, I think it's really the major thing one can do is to recognize that there are some things we can't be sure of one way or the other, and to be able to hold the space for you have this feeling that this memory is there and you just can't, and basically sort of everyone coming to terms with the uncertainty about what its source is. Now, the fact that it came in a therapeutic situation, in the context of therapy, right there, and the person had no idea previous to it, right there, that makes me suspicious of the memory. And I would be inclined to be skeptical of it unless there was some kind of corroborative evidence. So looking for, I don't know if this person had knows anyone else who was also affiliating with this adult as a child, and perhaps did any of these other individuals have experiences, ideally experiences that had been enduring, that hadn't been also recovered. That would be helpful to help to sort it out. But really recognizing that there are some things where you want to just not necessarily have certainty one way or the other.
I would just imagine that would get tricky because it's like, especially, with any reports of abuse, it's the one thing that's dangerous is to doubt the person or to cast, to say something like, well, I don't know if I believe you, or that couldn't be true. So I imagine it must be a difficult balance of people, the loved ones around, to validate that might be scary, that might be really upsetting, but also in their mind still have questions. I mean, that's tricky. That's tricky.
It is tricky, but the fact is that, or I shouldn't say the fact, the likelihood is that some of these memories are not factual. And yes, one doesn't want to necessarily challenge the veracity of someone's abuse memory, but one doesn't necessarily also want to call somebody or view someone as a perpetrator when they may not be. That's also, pretty bad socially normative thing to do. So this is the reason why people, sort of shy away from this. It's just it's a sticky wicket.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like not only is the problem vilifying the perpetrator, but as you were saying, these PTSD symptoms can come at the point of the discovery. And so validating this discovery, I could imagine, if it's false, would have its own set of problems for the
a lot of people
victim.
have become retractors, where they've even successfully sued their therapists for aggressive therapy that helped them pull out memories that later on they themselves concluded were false. And there has been, as far as I can tell, a reduction in the reports of these kinds of things, the court cases and so on. And I think this is because therapists have become more careful in terms of just being very aggressively trying to plant these memories.
The lesson for therapists here, I mean, so it sounds like it's pretty impossible to have to be able to judge like what proportion of these discovered memories are false versus true.
You're going to get a really big range of estimates. Beth Loftus would say virtually none are true. Bessel van der Kolk would probably say the majority are true. And I would say, I just don't know. What I know is that I'm pretty confident that some of them are true, and I think it's very likely that many of them are false.
Yeah. I mean, it's just interesting because I assume that these therapists who are kind of pushing these memories or just discovering come from the point of view that there are all of these repressed traumatic memories that need to be extracted. But it sounds like actually the party line is that that's not true, that most of these are false. And then there are people like you who are saying, well, I don't know, I've got corroborated cases of memories that were true.
Sorry to cut you off there. It really depends what party. This is where there's just real division. So, the APA put together a task force to try to come up with a sort of singular perspective, and they really couldn't. They ended up with sort of two different perspectives. So, we need to continue doing research on this and work on coming up with a more unified party line, ideally with researchers who are not wedded one way or the other to particular perspectives.
Well,
call to action.
Yeah, seriously, you've
That's a call
convinced me
to
that
action
memory
for every.
research is-
Yeah, no, it's like anyone listening who's a psychologist or a researcher, please, like, take up your mantle, because it sounds like you've had your time in the heat, and now it's time for other people to step up. But do you have any resources that, or books, or anything that if someone's really curious about this topic, something they could delve into? I mean, we'll put we'll link your paper from 2001, Discovering Memories of Abuse in the Light of Meta-Awareness by Dr. Jonathan Schooler, on the website. But is there anything else that you would recommend people look into?
There are a number of papers. There was a paper in, I think it's in Perspectives in Psychological Science. I don't remember the first author. I know Beth Loftus was an author on that reviewed, they refer to it as the memory wars that reviewed that. And that would provide a rather different perspective on the research than my perspective. You could also, so mine sort of gives you the middle way. There's also Bessel van der Kolk has written a fair bit on this. He would provide the more sort of clinical perspective. Richard McNally, as I mentioned, has written some, and he does, I still think he is rather strongly biased towards these being generally false, but he's been a bit more open to them being genuine, and he's written a couple books on it, and in which he specifically talks about this first hypothesis that I mentioned of shifting interpretations. So those would be some of the resources to look at, but I don't believe that there is a current work that provides the kind of balanced analysis that I think is called for.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. This is such a fascinating topic and a contentious one. So thanks for willing to throw your hat in.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was a lot of fun to explore these challenging and dark issues with you.
Absolutely. Well, I will see you at my wedding.
Okay.
And hopefully before then. All right. Bye, everyone. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.